The rain drizzled lightly, casting a silver sheen over the darkened street. Neon signs buzzed faintly above boarded-up shops, their flickering lights dancing on the puddles scattered across the cracked asphalt. A lone patrol car idled near the corner, its headlights cutting through the mist like probing fingers. Officer Liam Carter sat behind the wheel, his hand wrapped tightly around a lukewarm cup of coffee. He hated the late-night shifts, not just for the hours but for the way the city transformed after dark. It wasn't just shadows that lengthened here. Secrets seemed to crawl out of hidden corners, unraveling truths no one dared to confront during the day. Tonight felt different, though. There was an unease in the air, heavy and unrelenting, like the moment before a thunderclap. Liam's radio crackled, pulling his gaze toward it. Dispatch was calm, no calls of urgency, just a static reminder that this stretch of the city rarely slept. He glanced toward the sidewalk, his brows furrowing. Two figures emerged from the haze, their silhouettes sharp against the backdrop of dim streetlights. They moved in unison, their footsteps barely audible above the rain. They weren't adults, too small, too slight. As they drew closer, Liam realized they were children. Twins, he guessed. The kind of twins that made you blink twice to make sure they were real. They were identical in every way, from the tight braids framing their faces to the somber expressions etched deeply into their youthful features. Their matching black jackets glistened in the rain, droplets sliding off like tiny diamonds. Something about them made Liam's stomach twist, a gnawing sensation he couldn't quite name. He stepped out of the car, the door creaking loudly in the quiet street. "Hey, kids," he called, keeping his voice even, though a hint of unease lingered. "What are you doing out here this late?" The twins stopped a few feet away, their dark eyes fixed on him. They didn't speak, not right away. Instead, they exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations only siblings seemed capable of having. Liam noticed the way they stood, shoulder to shoulder, as if the world around them were an enemy they had already fought too many times. The older twin, he couldn't tell by much, maybe just by the slight lift of her chin, finally stepped forward. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Liam's chest tightened. There was something raw in her tone, something that sounded like fear but also like something deeper. Resignation. He crouched slightly, trying to meet her gaze. "What's going on? Are you hurt? Where are your parents?" The younger twin grabbed her sister's hand tightly, as if afraid she'd disappear. Then she leaned closer and said one word, just one, but it sliced through the air like a blade. "Listen." Liam froze. It wasn't what she said, but how she said it. Her voice was steady, deliberate, and far too calm for a child her age. The older sister nodded, and together the twins turned their heads toward the far end of the street. Liam followed their gaze, his hand instinctively moving toward the radio on his shoulder. The street seemed unnaturally quiet now, the faint hum of the city swallowed by an oppressive stillness. "What's over there?" Liam asked, his voice low. The older twin didn't answer. Instead, she pointed, her small finger trembling slightly. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a warning. Liam's instinct screamed at him to act, but act on what? The emptiness? The silence? He squinted through the rain, trying to make sense of the shadows in the distance. The twins remained still, their expressions unreadable but heavy with something unspoken. Then, from the far corner of the street, a low sound began to rise. It was faint at first, like the murmur of a distant crowd, but it grew steadily louder, layering itself with an eerie, guttural edge. Liam's radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't dispatch. It was static, sharp, grating, and accompanied by something else, a faint whisper that made his blood run cold. He reached for his shoulder mic, but before he could speak, the younger twin's voice cut through the noise, soft but commanding. "Don't." Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, Liam felt as though she could see right through him. His doubts, his fears, everything he'd buried deep beneath his badge. The older twin tugged at her sister's arm, and they stepped closer together, their small frames barely noticeable against the vastness of the street. "Shut it down," the older one said suddenly, her voice firmer now. "The street. All of it." Liam blinked, his mind racing. "What do you mean? Shut it down how? The so?" Older twin took a shaky breath, her hands clenched at her sides. "If you don't, they'll come." "Who's they?" Liam demanded, his voice rising slightly despite himself. The twins didn't answer. Instead, they turned to face each other, their foreheads nearly touching as they whispered something too faint for him to hear, and then just as suddenly they stopped. The streetlights began to flicker, casting long, erratic shadows that danced like phantoms. Liam's radio sputtered again, the static now accompanied by what sounded like faint laughter. Or was it crying? He couldn't tell, and that terrified him more than anything else. The twins stepped back, their movements unnervingly synchronized. The younger one looked up at him, her expression void of any childlike innocence. "Now," she said. Liam's pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't understand what was happening, but every instinct told him to listen. Reaching for the car's controls, he activated the sirens, flooding the street with red and blue light. He grabbed his radio, barking orders to block off the area, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. The twins didn't move. They stood rooted in place, their eyes fixed on something only they could see. Liam turned back toward the far end of the street, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound, the murmur, the whispers, whatever it was growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was words, fragmented and overlapping, spoken in a language he didn't recognize but felt deep in his bones. And then, the shadows at the edge of the street began to move. The shadows seemed to ripple at the edge of the street, and Officer Liam Carter felt the weight of the moment pressing on him like an iron hand. The twins stood motionless, watching him, their expressions unreadable. For a second, Liam wished he could blink and wake up somewhere else, anywhere but here. But the tension wasn't unfamiliar. It was the kind that had haunted him before, in a different time and place. Liam Carter hadn't always been the stoic figure in the blue uniform. There was a time not long ago when he didn't trust himself to make the right decisions. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood just on the other side of the city, where streets were named after trees but rarely lived up to their namesake. Violence had been as much a part of his upbringing as family dinners or school exams, and for years, Liam wrestled with the scars left behind. It wasn't just the gang fights or the police sirens wailing in the night. It was the loss. His younger brother Danny was a casualty of those streets, caught in the crossfire between two rival groups when he was only 16. Liam had been 18 at the time, a cocky, directionless teenager with no real ambitions. Danny's death had shattered him, pulling him into a spiral of anger and guilt that he carried to this day. But before Liam could drown completely, it was his mother who had dragged him back. She wasn't a woman of many words, but her voice still echoed in his mind during moments like this one. "You can't change the past," she'd told him once, as he sat on their porch in the dead of night, staring at the spot where Danny used to play basketball. "But you can decide what kind of man you want to be tomorrow. Choose better." The words had stuck. Joining the police force was his way of trying to choose better. At first, it had been about redemption, about trying to make up for the mistakes he thought he'd made. But over time, it became something else, protecting the vulnerable, standing between chaos and order. Tonight, though, as the shadows twisted and the twins' eerie presence unnerved him, Liam wasn't sure if he was strong enough for this. The rain intensified, hammering against the pavement as Liam radioed for backup. Static greeted him again, sharp and jagged, and his unease deepened. The shadows at the far end of the street hadn't stopped moving. If anything, they seemed closer now, though he couldn't tell if they were creeping forward or if the dim light was playing tricks on him. He glanced back at the twins, who remained perfectly still, drenched in rain but seemingly unfazed. "You need to tell me what's happening," Liam said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Who's coming? What am I stopping? The older twin tilted her head slightly, considering him. For a moment, Liam thought she wouldn't answer. Then softly she said, "You won't believe us." "Try me," he pressed. She hesitated, but the younger twin didn't. "They take people," the smaller girl said, her voice trembling. "They come when no one's looking. And then—" She trailed off, her gaze darting to the shadows. "They never come back." Liam felt a chill crawl up his spine. He wanted to dismiss it, chalk it up to childhood imagination or fear, but something about their conviction made it impossible. And then there was the sound. That low, unrelenting murmur that seemed to thrum in the air, too quiet to pinpoint but impossible to ignore. A sudden honk broke the tension, and Liam turned to see another patrol car pulling up. Officer Jenny Morales stepped out, her expression skeptical as she took in the scene. "Liam, what's going on?" she called, pulling her jacket tighter, around herself against the rain. He motioned her over, keeping an eye on the shadows. "We've got a situation," he said, his tone clipped. "The street needs to be shut down immediately." Jenny frowned, glancing at the twins. "What kind of situation? Who are they?" "Just trust me," Liam said, his voice carrying an edge. But Jenny wasn't the trusting type. She was sharp, pragmatic, and fiercely independent, qualities Liam respected, even if they often clashed. "You're going to need to give me more than that," she said, folding her arms. Before Liam could respond, the older twin spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's too late." Liam and Jenny both turned to eye. "Look at her." But the girl wasn't looking at them. Her eyes were fixed on the shadows, which now seemed to pulse as if alive. "What the hell is that?" Jenny muttered, her hand moving instinctively to her holster. The older twin stepped forward, her small frame trembling but determined. "You can't stop them," she said, her voice heavy with a certainty that made Liam's chest tighten. "But you can save some." "Save some?" Liam echoed, his mind racing. The younger twin reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to Liam without a word, her hand shaking slightly. He unfolded it, his heart sinking as he read the scrawled words. "Apartment. 407 South Tower. 10 minutes. "What is this?" Liam demanded, but the girls didn't answer. Instead, they stepped back, their expressions filled with something Liam couldn't quite place. Fear, yes, but also resolve. The shadows moved again, and this time there was no mistaking it. Figures began to emerge, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They were tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Their faces were hidden in darkness, but their movements were deliberate, purposeful. Jenny swore under her breath, drawing her weapon. "Liam, what the hell are we dealing with?" "I don't know," Liam admitted, his voice low. The older twin grabbed his arm, startling him. "You don't have time to figure it out," she said urgently. "You need to go, now." "And leave you here?" Liam asked, his protective instincts flaring. The girl shook her head. "They're not after us, they're after them." She gestured toward the shadows, where more figures were emerging. Jenny looked between the twins, Liam and the encroaching figures, her expression torn. "This is insane," she muttered. "Maybe," Liam said, his mind made up. He turned to Jenny, call for backup again, get this street locked down, and keep an eye on them." He nodded toward the twins. "What about you?" Jenny asked, her voice rising. Liam held up the note. "I'm going to find out what this means." Before she could argue, he was already moving toward his patrol car, the sound of the rain and whispers chasing him. As he drove toward the address scrawled on the note, his thoughts raced. Who or what were those figures? And why did the twins seem to know so much about them? He didn't have answers, but one thing was clear. Whatever awaited him at South Tower, it was only the beginning. Back on the street, Jenny watched as the shadows closed in, her hand tightening around her weapon. The twins stood motionless, their faces calm but their eyes filled with a silent warning. And then, the whispering stopped.